My daughter-in-law crossed a line with my husband just 1 week before we were supposed to sign our divorce papers, and I pretended I knew nothing. I remember the exact moment I learned the truth, because the afternoon light was falling across my dining room table in that quiet, golden way it always does around 4 o'clock, and everything looked so calm that it almost felt like a cruel joke. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 64 years old, and until that day, I believed I understood the people in my family. I had been married to Damon Carter for 42 years. 42 years of shared holidays, mortgage payments, late-night conversations about our son Wade, and the ordinary routines that slowly weave two lives together. By the time the divorce papers were drafted, I had already accepted that our marriage had simply grown tired. That happens sometimes. People change, silence grows longer, and eventually you reach a point where ending things peacefully feels kinder than continuing to pretend. That was how I saw it, at least. The house had been strangely quiet for months. Damon spent more time out of the house than in it, claiming meetings with old colleagues or long drives to clear his head. I didn't question him much. After 4 decades of marriage, you learn when pushing for answers will only make things worse. I focused instead on small routines that made the days manageable. I watered the roses along the fence line, brewed my coffee the same way every morning, and tried to picture what life might look like once the divorce was finalized. The plan was simple. We would meet with the attorney the following week, sign the paperwork, divide what needed dividing, and move forward with our separate lives. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't angry, it was just the quiet ending of a very long chapter.
That afternoon, I had just finished wiping down the kitchen counter when the doorbell rang. The sound surprised me because hardly anyone stopped by without calling first. When I opened the door, Sage Miller stood on my front porch. Sage is Ember's older sister. Ember, of course, is my daughter-in-law, married to my son Wade for nearly 10 years. Sage and I had always been cordial, but not especially close, so seeing her there unannounced immediately felt unusual. She looked nervous, the way someone looks when they've rehearsed a conversation 100 times but still don't know how to begin. I invited her inside and poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and we sat at the dining table where the sunlight stretched across the polished wood. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at her hands as if the right words might appear there if she waited long enough. Finally, she looked up and said quietly, "Naomi, I'm not sure how to tell you this, but you deserve to know." Those words are the kind that make the air feel heavier in a room. My first thought was that something had happened to Wade. My heart actually skipped before she continued. She told me she had seen Damon and Ember together earlier that week at a cafe near downtown. Not a casual conversation, not a quick hello. They were sitting close, speaking in that soft, private way people do when they think no one is watching. Sage said she watched them long enough to understand what she was seeing, and that was why she had driven across town to speak to me. I didn't cry when she said it. I didn't raise my voice or slam a hand on the table. Instead, I felt something colder settle inside me, the kind of calm that arrives when the truth finally explains 100 small things that never quite made sense before. I thanked Sage for telling me. Then I walked her to the door, wished her a safe drive home, and stood in the quiet hallway of my house for several minutes thinking about what I would do next. Because in that moment, I understood something very clearly. They thought I didn't know. And that mistake was about to change everything.
I did not sleep much that night after Sage left. The house felt different once the truth had been spoken out loud, as if the walls themselves had shifted slightly and nothing sat in quite the same place anymore. I moved through the room slowly, turning off lights that had already been off, straightening things that did not need straightening, simply trying to give my thoughts somewhere to go. When you spend 42 years building a life with someone, the habits of that life are everywhere. Damon's coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His jacket still hung on the chair near the garage door. For a long time, I simply stood there, looking at it, remembering how many mornings I had watched him leave the house wearing that same navy jacket while promising to be home for dinner. By the time the clock on the microwave showed 11:30, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think clearly. Anger would have been easier. Anger is loud and immediate. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more useful: understanding. Because once Sage had told me what she saw, 100 small memories began rearranging themselves into a picture that suddenly made sense. Damon's sudden interest in visiting Wade and Ember more often during the past year, the private jokes they shared at family dinners that always seemed to exclude the rest of us, the way Ember defended Damon during even the smallest disagreements, speaking for him before he had the chance to speak for himself. At the time, I thought it was simply respect for her father-in-law. Now, those moments replayed in my mind with a completely different meaning. Around midnight, I heard Damon's car pull into the driveway. I did not rush to confront him.
Instead, I rinsed my teacup and placed it carefully in the dishwasher before walking into the living room. Damon stepped inside a moment later, loosening his tie the way he always did after a long day out. He looked surprised to see me still awake. "Naomi," he said, "you should be sleeping. It is late." I told him I had been reading and lost track of time. That was not entirely a lie. In a way, I had been reading the story of my own life, only now the pages looked different. Damon walked to the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of water. For a few seconds, we stood there in the quiet house, like two polite strangers who happened to share the same address. Then he said something that might have sounded ordinary if I did not know what I knew. He reminded me about the appointment with the lawyer the following week. He said it would probably be a short meeting, and that signing the final documents would allow both of us to move forward peacefully. I nodded and told him I agreed. My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. Damon seemed relieved by that answer. I could see his shoulders relax slightly, as if he had been expecting resistance. Instead, I asked whether he wanted me to prepare dinner earlier the next evening, so we could talk about the practical details of dividing the house and accounts. He smiled in that tired, grateful way people do when they believe a difficult situation is finally resolving itself. That was the moment I realized something important. Damon believed the story he had constructed. He believed that our marriage was ending quietly, that I suspected nothing more complicated than simple distance between two aging spouses. And that belief made everything easier for the plan forming in my mind. Later that night, after Damon went upstairs, I sat alone on the couch and stared out the window at the dark outline of the maple tree in our front yard. I had planted that tree 30 years earlier, when Wade was still in high school. Life grows slowly, branch by branch, year by year, until one day you realize how tall it has become. But the same is true for betrayal. It does not appear all at once. It grows quietly in the spaces where trust used to live. I folded my hands in my lap and made a decision right there in the dim living room light. I would not accuse anyone. I would not argue or reveal what Sage had told me. Instead, I would do something far more effective. I would wait. Because the people who believe they are getting away with something almost always reveal more than they intend. I woke the next morning before the sun came up, the way I often did after a restless night, and for a few quiet seconds I simply lay there, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Damon was still asleep beside me, breathing slowly, completely unaware that the world he thought he understood had already shifted. I watched the faint morning light creep through the curtains and felt that same calm settle over me again, the calm that comes when a decision has already been made. By the time Damon came downstairs an hour later, the kitchen smelled like coffee and toasted bread, just like any other morning during the past 4 decades. I stood at the stove turning eggs in a skillet while the radio played softly on the counter. Damon greeted me with the same tired half-smile he had worn for months, the polite expression of a man who had already emotionally moved on from the life around him. He thanked me for breakfast and sat down at the table, scrolling through something on his phone. I watched him for a moment and realized how easily people reveal themselves when they believe they are safe. There was no tension in his voice, no hesitation in his movements. Whatever he had planned with Ember, he believed it was unfolding exactly as intended. I asked him whether he had spoken to Wade recently, keeping my tone casual as I set a plate in front of him. Damon said they had talked briefly the previous evening. Wade and Ember were apparently planning to come by later in the week to discuss some family matters before the lawyer meeting. Damon said it would be good for everyone to keep things respectful and organized. I nodded as if that made perfect sense. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you know it exists, the entire world becomes easier to read. Every small gesture becomes a piece of information. The way Damon avoided certain details, the way he chose his words carefully whenever Ember's name appeared in conversation.
Even the way he finished his coffee quickly and announced he had errands to run before noon, none of it surprised me anymore. After he left the house, I cleaned the kitchen slowly, letting the quiet give me time to think. I did not rush. People often believe revenge must be loud or dramatic, but the most effective kind is almost invisible until the final moment. Around 10:30 that morning, my phone rang. The caller identification showed Wade's name. My son sounded cheerful when I answered, the same warm voice I had heard since the day he first learned how to speak. He asked how I was doing and whether I needed help preparing for the meeting with the attorney next week. I told him everything was fine and that his father and I were handling the paperwork calmly. Wade sounded relieved by that answer. Then he mentioned that Ember wanted to stop by with him for dinner the following Sunday. He said she felt terrible about how difficult the past year had been for the family and wanted everyone to sit down together before the divorce was finalized. I could almost picture Ember standing nearby while he spoke, listening closely to make sure the story sounded convincing. I told Wade that dinner would be a wonderful idea. After all, family meals had always been important to me. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the counter and allowed myself a small smile. Sunday dinner had been a tradition in our house for decades. It was where birthdays were celebrated, good news was shared, and sometimes difficult conversations took place. But this particular dinner would be different. Because by the time Wade and Ember walked through my front door that evening, I would already know exactly how their little plan was supposed to end. And more importantly, I would know precisely how to change it. The rest of that week moved forward with a strange kind of normal rhythm, the kind that would have looked perfectly ordinary to anyone standing outside my life. Damon left the house each morning around 8:30 with the same casual goodbye he had used for years, and each evening he returned with the same tired voice, explaining that the day had been long and complicated. If anything, he seemed lighter than he had been in months, almost relieved. I noticed that right away. A man who is worried about losing something usually carries tension in his shoulders, but Damon walked through the front door with an ease that told me he believed the future was already arranged in his favor. That realization confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Whatever he and Ember had been planning had reached the stage where they felt confident enough to relax. And confidence, I have learned, is when people become careless. On Thursday afternoon, I drove across town to run a few errands that had been waiting for weeks. I stopped at the grocery store, picked up fresh vegetables, and bought a small bouquet of white lilies for the dining table. Sunday dinner was only a few days away, and I wanted the house to look exactly the way it always had when my family gathered there. The same polished wood table, the same blue ceramic plates that Wade loved when he was a child, the same quiet warmth that had defined our home for decades. Traditions can be powerful things, especially when people believe they understand what those traditions mean. Later that evening, Damon mentioned that he might meet Wade the next day to discuss some paperwork connected to the divorce settlement. He said it casually while looking at his phone, as though the conversation carried no deeper meaning. I simply nodded and asked whether he would still be home in time for dinner. He said yes, most likely. The next morning, I woke early again and made coffee while the sky outside slowly brightened. The quiet of the kitchen gave me time to think carefully about everything Sage had told me and everything I had observed since then. I remembered small details that had once seemed unimportant. A weekend last spring when Damon suddenly insisted on helping Wade repair something at their house, even though he had never shown much interest in home projects before. A family barbecue during the summer where Ember spent more time speaking privately with Damon on the patio than she did sitting beside her own husband. At the time, those moments felt harmless. Now they looked like pieces of a story that had been developing quietly right in front of me. By midday Friday, I received a short message from Wade confirming that he and Ember would arrive Sunday evening around 6. He thanked me for inviting them and said Ember was planning to bring dessert. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. Ember bringing dessert was almost funny in its own way. For 10 years, she had never once brought dessert to a family dinner without being asked. That small gesture told me something important. She wanted to appear thoughtful. She wanted the evening to feel cooperative and friendly. In other words, she wanted the scene to match the story they believed was unfolding. That afternoon, I walked through each room of the house, noticing the familiar photographs along the hallway walls. Wade as a child holding his first baseball glove. Damon and I standing together beside the maple tree we planted in the yard. Ember smiling at her wedding reception, her arm wrapped proudly around my son. Families built their histories slowly, moment by moment, until the memories fill entire rooms. But sometimes the truth behind those memories changes.
As evening approached, I began preparing the meal I planned to serve Sunday night. Roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, and the lemon cake Wade had always loved. The kitchen filled with the comforting scent of herbs and butter as I tested the recipe. Anyone watching would have seen an ordinary woman preparing dinner for her family. What they would not have seen was the quiet certainty growing stronger inside me with every passing hour. By the time Sunday evening arrived, the table would be set exactly the way it always had been, and everyone who sat around it would believe they understood what kind of conversation was about to happen. They would be wrong. Sunday arrived with the kind of quiet sunlight that makes a house feel warm and peaceful long before any guests walk through the door. I woke early again, not because I was anxious, but because my mind had already accepted that this day would move everything forward. The kitchen felt calm as I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and opened the windows to let in the cool morning air. Outside, the maple tree in the yard shifted gently in the breeze, its branches casting soft shadows across the grass. For a moment, I stood there watching it and thinking about how many Sunday dinners that tree had witnessed over the years. Wade learned to ride his bicycle under that tree. Damon once built a small wooden swing for him there. Families grow around places like that, layer after layer of memories that seem permanent until something quietly changes beneath the surface. By mid-afternoon, the house looked exactly the way it always had before a family dinner. The dining table was polished until the wood reflected the overhead light. The blue ceramic plates were arranged carefully beside folded linen napkins. A small vase of white lilies sat in the center of the table, their scent filling the room with a soft sweetness. In the kitchen, the roast chicken rested in the oven while the potatoes finished roasting beside it. Everything appeared ordinary, predictable, comforting. That was important. People reveal more about themselves when they feel comfortable. Damon spent most of the afternoon moving around the house in a relaxed mood that I had not seen from him in months. He even hummed quietly while checking messages on his phone, which was something he used to do years ago when life felt uncomplicated. Watching him like that almost made the situation feel surreal, as if we were actors performing a familiar scene that only I knew had a different ending. Around 5:30, he asked whether Wade and Ember were still expected at 6. I confirmed that they were and asked if he would mind setting out the glasses while I finished preparing the green beans. He agreed without hesitation. There was something almost ironic about seeing him help prepare the table where the evening's conversation would unfold. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Damon walked toward the front door while I dried my hands on a kitchen towel. A moment later, I heard Wade's familiar voice greeting his father in the hallway. Wade sounded cheerful and relaxed, exactly the way a son should sound when visiting his parents. Ember followed just behind him, carrying a small white bakery box tied with a ribbon. When they stepped into the dining room, Ember smiled warmly and placed the box on the counter. She said she had brought lemon cream cake from a bakery she knew Wade loved. Her voice carried that practiced brightness that people use when they want to appear thoughtful and cooperative. I thanked her and told her it looked wonderful. Wade gave me a brief hug before sitting down at the table. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. Wade asked about the garden. Damon mentioned a friend he had seen earlier that week. Ember complimented the smell of the roast chicken. Anyone walking past the house might have assumed they were hearing a peaceful family gathering. But beneath those polite exchanges, I noticed the subtle glances passing between Damon and Ember. They were quick, almost invisible, but once you know where to look, they become impossible to ignore. Those glances carried quiet confidence, the silent understanding between two people who believe their plans are already secure. Dinner itself passed smoothly. Plates were filled, glasses were refilled, and the conversation remained polite. When the meal ended, Ember stood and offered to bring out the dessert she had brought. I told her that sounded perfect. She placed the cake in the center of the table, while Wade reached for a knife to cut the first slice. Damon leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who believes the difficult part of the evening is already behind him. I watched them all for a moment and realized something simple and powerful. Each person sitting at that table believed they understood the story we were living, and not one of them realized that the story was about to change. For a few quiet minutes after the cake was placed on the table, the evening continued exactly the way everyone expected it to. Wade cut the first slice and handed it to Ember, then another slice to Damon, and finally one to me. The lemon cream cake looked beautiful, carefully decorated with thin curls of white frosting and small pieces of candied lemon on top. Ember smiled with quiet satisfaction as she watched everyone taste it. Damon even complimented the bakery, saying it might be the best dessert he had eaten in months. Wade laughed and said that Ember had been talking about that bakery all week. Their voices sounded warm and relaxed, and for a moment, the scene almost looked like something from a family photo. But I had learned something important over the past few days. People who believe they are winning rarely notice the details that matter. I set my fork down gently and folded my hands on the table. The conversation slowed as they noticed the shift in my posture. There is a certain silence that appears when people sense something unexpected is about to happen, even if they cannot yet explain what it is. I looked around the table at the three people sitting across from me. Wade looked curious, Damon looked calm, and Ember looked politely attentive, the way someone does when waiting for a conversation to turn in their favor. I told them that before we finished dessert, there was something practical I wanted to discuss about the meeting with the attorney scheduled for the following week. Damon nodded immediately, clearly believing I was about to confirm the same arrangement he had already imagined. Wade leaned slightly forward in his chair. Ember kept her pleasant smile, but I noticed the quick glance she gave Damon, the kind of silent check people make when they want reassurance that everything is still moving according to plan. I explained that during the past few days, I had been reviewing some documents connected to our finances and the house. I spoke slowly and calmly, the way I always had when discussing important matters. I said that after 42 years of marriage, I believed it was important for everything to be handled carefully and respectfully. Damon agreed right away, repeating that the goal of the divorce was to keep things simple and fair for everyone. He spoke with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Wade nodded along with him. Ember said very little, but the slight lift at the corner of her smile suggested that she was pleased with how smoothly the conversation was unfolding. I let them speak for a moment before continuing. I told them that while looking through our paperwork, I had also contacted someone who had helped Damon and me organize our legal documents several years earlier. That part caught Damon's attention. His expression changed just slightly, not alarmed, but curious. He asked which documents I meant. I explained that years ago, when Wade first started his career, Damon and I had updated several legal agreements to make sure our property and savings were protected properly. It had been one of those responsible decisions couples make after decades together. At the time, it felt like nothing more than routine planning for the future. Wade looked surprised and said he did not remember hearing about that. I told him that was understandable because it had happened long before he and Ember were married. Then I reached beside my chair and lifted a simple folder that had been resting quietly against the table leg all evening. I placed it gently on the table between us. The room grew noticeably quieter as the folder slid across the polished wood surface. Damon's eyes followed the movement carefully now, his earlier confidence beginning to shift into something more uncertain. Ember straightened slightly in her chair. Wade looked back and forth between all of us, clearly sensing that the evening had just changed direction in a way he had not expected. I rested my hand on the folder for a moment before speaking again. My voice remained calm, steady, and almost thoughtful. I told them that sometimes the most important decisions people make in life are the ones they forget about later, and sometimes those forgotten decisions become very important again when circumstances change. For several seconds, no one spoke after I placed the folder on the table. The quiet felt heavier than any argument could have been. Damon leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder as if trying to remember something he could not quite reach. Wade looked confused, shifting his gaze between me and his father. Ember remained very still, her hands resting neatly beside her plate, though I noticed the careful attention in her eyes. I slowly opened the folder and turned it so that Damon could see the first page. The document looked ordinary at first glance, just another legal agreement filled with careful language and official signatures. But Damon recognized it immediately. I could see the recognition appear across his face the same way clouds pass across sunlight. His relaxed posture faded, replaced by a tighter expression that told me the memory had finally returned.
I reminded him calmly that many years earlier, we had signed a prenuptial agreement when we reorganized our property after selling our first house and purchasing the one we live in now. At the time, it had seemed like a responsible financial decision, the kind couples make when they want to make sure their future remains stable no matter what happens. Wade looked surprised again and asked why something like that had never come up before. I explained gently that agreements like that often stay quietly in the background for decades because people rarely expect to need them. Damon cleared his throat and asked why I had suddenly decided to bring it up now. His voice remained controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I turned the page and pointed to a paragraph halfway down the document. The language was simple but precise, written by attorneys who understood exactly how important clarity can be when circumstances change.
Wade frowned slightly as he tried to understand what that meant. Ember's smile had disappeared now, replaced by a careful stillness that revealed far more than words could have. Damon's eyes moved slowly across the page as he read the clause again. I allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, because sometimes silence explains things more clearly than speech. Finally, I spoke again, keeping my tone steady and calm. I told them that during the past few days, I had taken the time to review our records and confirm the exact wording of that clause with the attorney who helped us prepare the document all those years ago. According to the agreement, if either spouse entered into a relationship that violated the terms outlined before the divorce was legally completed, the financial arrangement would change dramatically. Certain assets that were originally intended to be divided equally would instead remain solely with the other spouse. That included the house, the lake property we purchased 10 years ago, and a significant portion of our shared investments. Wade looked at his father with growing confusion as he tried to process what I was saying. Damon remained silent, still staring at the page, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less certain. Ember finally spoke, her voice careful and quiet as she asked whether I was suggesting that the agreement applied to the current situation. I met her eyes calmly and told her that I was not suggesting anything at all. I was simply explaining what the document clearly stated. Then I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on top of it. The room felt completely different now, as though the balance of the evening had quietly shifted to a place no one else had expected.
Damon finally leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence gone. Wade sat frozen, still trying to understand how an ordinary family dinner had suddenly turned into something far more complicated. Ember looked down at the table for a brief moment before lifting her eyes again, and in that silence, the truth that had been hidden all week finally settled into the room, where none of them could ignore it any longer.
No one reached for their dessert after that. The slices of lemon cake remained untouched on the plates as the quiet around the table deepened into something much heavier. Wade was the first to speak, though his voice sounded uncertain, like someone trying to understand a conversation that had suddenly moved too far ahead of him. He looked at Damon and asked whether what I had said was true. Damon did not answer immediately. He was still staring at the folder, as if the document inside had somehow betrayed him. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the slow realization that the plan he believed was secure had overlooked something important. Ember sat perfectly still beside Wade, her earlier confidence gone now, replaced by the careful silence of someone who knows that speaking too quickly could make things worse. After a long moment, Damon finally cleared his throat and said that the agreement was old and probably no longer relevant. He said documents like that were often written with broad language that did not apply to modern situations. His voice sounded steady, but the certainty he had carried all evening was no longer there. I listened patiently before responding. I explained that I had already spoken with the attorney who prepared the agreement and that he confirmed the document remained legally binding. I told them that I had also asked him to review the clause again earlier that week to make sure I understood exactly how it would apply if the circumstances described in the agreement occurred before the divorce was finalized. Wade looked back and forth between us with growing confusion. He asked what circumstances we were talking about. For a moment, the room felt completely still. Damon said nothing. Ember lowered her eyes toward the table, her fingers resting tightly together in her lap. That silence answered Wade's question more clearly than any explanation could have. I spoke calmly then, choosing my words carefully, because anger would only make the situation easier for them to dismiss. I said that over the past week, I had learned enough to understand that the situation described in the agreement had already occurred. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone directly. I simply stated the truth as plainly as possible. Wade's expression changed immediately. The confusion in his face shifted into disbelief as he looked at Ember first and then at his father. He asked them both if there was something they needed to explain. Damon tried to speak, but the words did not come easily now. Ember finally lifted her eyes again, but the confidence that had once lived there had faded. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely uncertain. I allowed them a moment, because sometimes the hardest part of truth is simply hearing it spoken aloud. Then I told Wade that I had not invited everyone to dinner in order to start a fight. I had invited them because I believed that important decisions should be made with honesty, especially when those decisions affect the future of an entire family. I explained that according to the agreement Damon and I signed years ago, any violation of the clause we had just discussed meant that the financial terms of the divorce would immediately change. The house we were sitting in would remain entirely in my name. The lake property that Damon planned to keep would also remain under my ownership. A significant portion of the shared investments would no longer be divided the way he expected. Wade stared at the table as he processed what that meant. Damon leaned back slowly in his chair, the quiet realization settling across his face that the future he had imagined was no longer possible. Ember said nothing at all now. She simply looked at the folder on the table, as though it had become the most important object in the room. I rested my hands calmly beside my plate and spoke one final time, my voice steady and quiet. I said that sometimes people believe they are changing the direction of someone else's life, but what they are really doing is revealing their own choices. And once those choices are clear, the consequences tend to follow naturally. The silence that followed my last words lingered over the table like a heavy curtain. No one reached for their dessert. The small slices of lemon cake sat untouched, the frosting beginning to soften under the warm light above the table. Wade was the first person who finally moved. He leaned back slowly in his chair, looking from Damon to Ember and then back to me, as if he were trying to place every piece of the evening into a picture that finally made sense. His voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it when he asked a simple question that carried the weight of everything that had just been revealed. He asked Damon if what I had said was true. For the first time that night, Damon did not answer right away. The confident certainty he had carried through dinner had vanished completely now. Instead, he looked tired, older somehow, as if the years we had spent together had suddenly become visible in the lines around his eyes. Eventually he spoke, but his explanation sounded uncertain even to himself. He said that things had become complicated during the past few months, that emotions had been confusing, and that no one had intended for the situation to unfold this way. Wade listened without interrupting, but the disappointment on his face was impossible to miss. Ember tried to speak once, saying that she never meant for anyone to get hurt, but her voice faded before she could finish the sentence. I did not argue with either of them. There was no need. The truth had already been placed on the table between us, more clearly than any accusation could have done. After a moment, I closed the folder and slid it gently back toward my side of the table. I told them that the legal meeting next week would continue as planned, but the outcome would reflect the terms of the agreement Damon and I had signed many years ago. The house would remain mine. The lake property would remain mine as well. The rest of the financial arrangements would be handled according to the document that Damon himself had once agreed was fair and responsible. Damon lowered his eyes to the table, understanding now that the future he had imagined had already disappeared. Wade stood up slowly from his chair, running a hand across his forehead as if trying to clear his thoughts. He looked at Ember for a long moment, and the silence between them said more than any argument could have expressed. Finally, he turned back toward me and said that he needed time to understand everything that had happened. I nodded and told him that I understood. Families are complicated, and sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we never expected to face. Ember remained seated for several seconds after Wade moved away from the table. When she finally stood, she avoided looking directly at me. There was no anger in her expression anymore, only the quiet realization that the situation she believed she controlled had taken a different direction. Damon rose more slowly,
his movements careful, as though the room itself had become unfamiliar to him. For 42 years we had shared that house together, but in that moment it felt as if we were already living separate lives.
Wade walked toward the front door first. Ember followed him, and Damon paused briefly before leaving the dining room. He looked back at the table, where the untouched dessert still sat beside the folded napkins and empty glasses. Then he left without saying anything else. After the door closed, the house returned to the same quiet calm it had held earlier that morning. I gathered the plates slowly and carried them into the kitchen. The lemon cake remained on the table for a few minutes longer before I wrapped it carefully and placed it in the refrigerator. Outside the window, the maple tree moved gently in the evening breeze, just as it had for decades. Some things in life remain steady, no matter how much the people around them change. I turned off the dining room light and stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the peaceful silence of the house that would remain mine. Then I walked upstairs, knowing that the next chapter of my life would begin with something simple and powerful. The truth had finally been spoken, and the rest of the story would unfold from there.